Hey guys, I'm Tim.
I'm voidrx.
Hey everyone, I'm Rowan.
What's up, guys? I'm God Cubing. Welcome to the Methodical Cubing Podcast.
In this episode, voidrx and I interview Shadowslice about methods such as Ssc, 42, and Mcell, as well as his thoughts on other method development topics.
So we're going to first start with a section about just general cubing. When did you start cubing, and what method did you originally start with?
I started cubing more or less in 2014 or 2015, depending on exactly when you start counting from. Obviously, I started with the beginner's method, but I think that's probably not what you're asking. The first complicated method I learned was probably CFOP, actually. Although I learned all four of the big four methods really relatively quickly. So I learned CFOP, Roux, ZZ, Petrus, probably within a couple of weeks of each other. And since then, I've always really just been using Roux as my quote-unquote main method, but I like to think I've kept a reasonable level of proficiency with all of them. So 15 seconds or better with all of them.
So it seems that you have reached a sort of equilibrium between focusing on method development and achieving fast times in 3x3 and 3x3 one-handed. Most cubers usually focus on one or the other, with most focusing on speed solving. So how have you managed to make this balance?
Well, I suppose I've never really specifically set time aside for cubing in general, either be that speed solving or method development. It's always just been something that I've done when I'd otherwise be bored or not really doing anything. So I guess my answer would be it's just something that I've done during downtime. So it's not as though I really put focus on one or the other, especially when it comes to method development. It's more just if some inspiration strikes me or I suddenly have some idea or something triggers an idea in me that then suddenly I can go have a look at a method, see if it works, see if it doesn't work, see why it might work, and so on. When it comes to practicing, yeah, if I'm just feeling tired and I don't really want to think or do anything else, like say, I don't know, play chess, I'll just sit down with a cube and do some solves until, well, I've got something else to do, or I just go to sleep or something, I guess. So.
You have a pretty a sort of unique approach to block building. You can achieve sub. I think you got a sub 7 average of 100 move count for first block in Roux. How would you describe or how you approach inspection and achieving sub 7 with only X2Y color neutrality?
Yeah, so I'll be honest, I don't think what I really do with block building is especially unique. I think what's the unique part about it is that I have systematized it, so to speak. So I could explain what goes through my head when I'm block building when others potentially couldn't. But so I think specifically you're probably alluding to the frameworks idea when it comes to first block. I think that's something that most good Roux solvers will actually do. It's just that they haven't thought to explain it that way before. But realistically, low move counts for Roux are just a lot of practice more than anything.
On your YouTube channel, you have a series called Why X Method Sucks. And what was the original inspiration for that?
Well, the main reason is that well, it's been a very long-running theme, I think, in my thinking about methods, in that I've just found it frustrating how people go about comparing methods. So, partially speaking, that series is to satirize those people who just say, your method is bad because X, Y, Z, my method is good because A, B, C. So, so yes, the series is kind of meant to be funny in a way, but it's also meant to be just giving a demonstration of how almost ridiculous most people's way of comparing methods is. So I guess the reason that I made it the way I did was because it's fairly light-hearted. I mean, you still get people being really offended by everything who think I'm serious, but I suppose you get that with all semi-satirical media. But yeah, it's just meant to be a bit of fun, essentially, for how people go about comparing methods and just showing how ridiculous most of it is, I guess.
Would you ever consider making more of them in the future for new methods like Nautilus or Mehta?
That's an interesting question, because if you notice, the specific methods I did pick with that, they're all older methods, and they're all ones that have been well established, so to speak. So I think I would prefer to go after methods which have been well established, because otherwise it feels like I'm sort of just punching down instead of punching up. So if those new methods get well established, or perhaps if they go in the opposite direction and just fall out of fashion, then yes, I would probably consider making a few more if the fancy ever strikes me. But well, I mean, I say I don't want to punch down like it's so high and noble, but I think the more accurate reason is, I don't know, maybe I'm just being a bit of a coward in that I don't want actual massive flame wars when it comes to everything, because with these newer methods in particular, maybe not so much the ones that Athafray makes or one similar in that vein, but particularly with, say, Meta, you get a lot of probably overzealous people, I would say, and just creating a flame war is not really something that I want to set out to do.
Yeah. It's always smart to proceed with caution.
Yep.
All right, so we're moving on to the section with about 42. So what caused you to come up with the idea of 42? Like, were you like actively looking for methods that would involve some sort of conjugation, or did you just come across the idea of like how like conjugation and combining it with root?
Well, the idea of conjugation has it's sort of been in the back of my mind. You can, if you have a look at, say, Mcell, which is one of my earlier methods, I do in a few posts suggest what essentially is conjugation, although I hadn't quite so specifically put into words how it works just yet. So if you look further back, the idea is there, specifically being given a form. If we talk about 42 specifically, the trigger for that actually came from Tyrannical Caterpillar, TC, which is the alteration to Rue that, well, it was Keon for one, and I forget who exactly helped him generate all the algorithms, but essentially I just sort of looked at that and thought, well, I can do better than this. And then once I realized what conjugation was and how it could be used and all of that, everything just sort of fell into place very quickly. So so I would say the idea of conjugation had been in the back of my head for a while, but I hadn't specifically thought of how to apply it just yet beyond basic case reduction until the idea of Tyrannical Caterpillar came across.
How did you figure out how to recognize and execute conjugated Cmll? Because if you don't know what it is, it looks very complicated on first look.
Yeah, well, I always knew that there was a way to do it, because if you look at what 42 does mathematically, In terms of code sets, it's quite a simple extension of like AUFing in PLL. So I knew there was a way to do it, and basically the first way I tried was just to try and recog it like Cmll, working it out slowly, working out what stickers you could use, what stickers you couldn't use, and yeah, eventually it just all worked out. But I wouldn't say I really had a general recognition scheme until I basically just listed every single case. So I literally just took oh dear, Visual Cube. Yeah, it must have been Visual Cube, and put in all of the algorithms conjugated with all of the different moves, and then just looking through them, the patterns just sort of appeared out to me very quickly. If using a CMLL sort of recognition.
Yeah. So you just like brute forced it.
Yeah, more or less. Like it's not as say clever as Athaphrase stuff or Jason stuff. Some of the people have actually looked at the recognition. It's very much just a brute force. Here is a case. You use this algorithm to solve it, and so on.
That's interesting. I didn't know it was brute force. That's cool.
Yeah. So you've said before that you like a more intuitive approach to L7E. What are your thoughts on the movement towards a more algorithmic approach of solving like the last 7 edges?
Well, it's quite potential. I think intuitive versus algorithmic in this sense may be a bit of a misnomer in the sense that I would prefer some sort of iterative EO and so on. So if you have a look at LSE and RU, that's the sort of approach I'd like. So you have a set of tools, but it's up to the solver to apply those tools in a way to make it efficient. So the thing is, the feeling I always have when it comes to algorithms is that algorithms are what you use if you have no other choice in how to do a step. But I've always felt that L7E in particular can be done intuitively and probably should be done intuitively. So you can introduce things like EOLR into the solving, which are technically algorithms, but they don't necessarily behave like algorithms, if that makes sense. It's the same for the 4C cases. Strictly speaking, they probably are more on the algorithmic side, but you would never really think of them as algorithms, so to speak. So really, when you say a movement towards more algorithmic solving of the last 7 edges, I'm not strictly opposed to it so much as I just find the approach inelegant, if that makes sense.
I see what you mean, yeah. So what would your recommendation be for a different, like more intuitive way to do L7E?
Yeah, well, like I said, it's very much, my thoughts are very much bound up in how LSE works. I guess, as before, what Athaphrase is doing, trying to look at, say, more little r, big R solutions in L7E for EO specifically is probably the best way to do it. So instead of just having MU, M prime, MU prime, M prime, and so on for EO, you could also have, say, RU, R prime, and so on for EO and that sort of stuff instead.
Do you think that 42 could capitalize more off of its conjugation during L7E, which other L7E methods lack, like Waterman or Waterroo?
Yes, so the main thing that's, well, I guess the way I do it sort of does capitalize on it in that you kind of have 2 modes. You have one where the block is conjugated and one where the block is not conjugated. So both of those can more or less be solved like LSE can be solved, with the exception of one edge. So the reason I like 42 is that switch between those two modes quite freely when doing last 7 edges, which, I mean, I guess is technically possible with things like Waterman last 7 edges if done in the same MUR way. But yeah, having it pre-conjugated just feels a lot freer. So instead of having to solve some stuff, then conjugate it, then solve some more stuff, then unconjugate it, you can just solve some stuff, unconjugate, and finish, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
Do you remember which cases have better algs than Cmll?
Well, the specific one that I like to bring up is there's a case which, not typically speaking, is solved with a Y-perm, but if you unconjugate it in a specific way, it actually turns out to just be bars U, which is clearly a much nicer algorithm than a diag swap, because, well, basically anything is. But the key to it is that if you get a bad case when it's either conjugated or not conjugated, you could quite easily just, well, conjugate or unconjugate, as the case may be, and almost certainly end up with a nice algorithm.
The amount of algorithms that could be approved upon is it like a pretty low number, or?
I guess it depends on how bad you think the cases are necessarily. So there are definitely a few algorithms where, like the Y-perm example, it's just clearly better to switch the case you have, so to speak. But there are going to be a lot more cases which are more borderline in that it may be worth it to conjugate it, do a different alg, and then go straight into the last 7 edges, because you don't necessarily have to reconjugate, because that's just how last 7 edges works. But it depends if you think doing, say, U star R prime, and then the algorithm is better than doing the original algorithm.
We're moving on to the SSC section. So before we start, for listeners who don't know what SSC is, could you give a quick overview of the steps of SSC?
Short answer, no, not really. A slightly longer answer. I guess the basic steps would be an EO edge, which is orienting all the edges and then solving the front left edge and the back left edge, and so on. And then after that, you do some weird pseudo stuff, which ends up orienting everything so that you can solve it with only double moves, U moves, and D moves. And then you just somehow try and finish it in a way that's not been particularly well defined just yet. So it's sort of like the human Thistlethwaite algorithm, or more bluntly, the Kosiamba's algorithm, which is implemented in cube solvers. Although I suspect if you don't know what SSC is, you probably won't know what those two are either.
Yeah.
And before that, it gets to last 8 edges, or Lie, and domino reduction, correct?
Yes, so the aim of SSE is essentially getting to domino reduction as quickly as possible. And then there's the big question, I suppose the big problem with SSC is that it appears there just isn't a fast human solvable way to do domino reduction. Or at least there isn't a way that's fast enough to... There isn't a way that is as fast as it feels like it should be possible to do domino reduction.
Yeah, my biggest thing is it feels like, especially like with Meta 6CP, a lot, like basically all of the 6CP algorithms are all R2 UD algorithms, and
Yeah.
it was determined that it was not worth it to do 6CP and you should just do CDRLL because of the large amount of R2s, and like it wasn't just that, there was also the recognition, but that was a big part of it. So all the R2s and you use these at the end of SSC are also my biggest hitch with it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, well, if you look at square one, in theory, it shouldn't be that bad, but yeah, just something about it just doesn't feel as fast as just doing something like PLL with all of the quarter turns and such. I don't know, I'm still slightly hopeful that one day someone will work it out, but I'll be honest, it's been must be what, 7 years by now, and people have been looking at domino reduction since even before that, and no one's really found anything. So I can be optimistic. I don't know if it's really smart to be optimistic at this point.
Currently, I am doing a belt method for method march, and the way that I get to domino reduction is to do EO belt, and then in theory you could do an algorithm, one of 191 algorithms to orient all 8 corners simultaneously, and that would be, I feel like that might be faster in theory because just one algorithm after EO belt.
Yeah. The main question I'd ask is, how would you recognize that? So.
Yeah, that's something that's being worked on.
Yeah, no, I can see there being approaches which are similarly fast to SSC, or at least similarly efficient. It's just that when you're looking at everything on the cube at the same time, almost, it's incredibly hard to do anything. Well, assuming that you're not doing it all in an inspection, like you could on, say, 2x2, for example.
Who were your major influences when you conceptualized and developed SSC?
Who were my major influences? Oh, that's an... well, if you go have a look at the original post, yeah, basically I just picked up a square one and I thought, oh, this solving is cool. Maybe I can do something like that for 3x3. And so yeah, so what I originally came up with was EO edge followed by one EO edge plus one, so 3/4 belt with EO, and then you can do sort of winter variation with that. It was actually another forum user, SQARE, who suggested doing something with pseudo pairs and pseudo triplets, which is what very quickly developed into the current mature form of SSC. So we worked together on that for a bit, and yeah, that is the form that we currently have now. But initially, it was very much, I just got on a square one. I thought square one was quite cool, so I thought maybe we could solve 3x3 like the square one. Yeah, that's actually something you'll see is quite a common theme. I'll come across something in some other parts. Initially, it was new puzzles. More recently, it's been just various mathematical ideas and concepts. But I'll just think, this could be cool if we implement it in a speed solving method or just a method in general. And then I'll spend maybe a month working out something, and then I'll post it, and then yeah, I guess I just kind of move on after that, because I've always been fairly flighty when it comes to specific interests like that. I'll come up with an idea, I'll put it out there for others to play with, maybe come back if someone's actually doing something interesting with it.
Yeah, so you kind of already addressed this, but do you think that SSC would be able to compete with top methods, such as Roux, CFOP, ZZ, and all the Petrus stuff?
In its current form, no, I don't think so. I don't think it's good enough for that, at least not when it comes to, say, raw speed solving. But yeah, like I said before, if there is a way to to do to solve the cube from domino reduction in an efficient and fast and look aheadable way, then yeah, I don't see why it couldn't. But also, as I said before, it's been 7 years. Maybe there just isn't a way.
What developments do you think could be done in the future for SSC?
I guess with respect to getting the cube solved from domino reduction, it may be possible to go through some less obvious subsets of the cube. So instead of, say, just solving the corners and solving the edges, or say building a block and then solving the rest of it, what you could do instead is find some configuration of corners which for some reason just enables you to do edges every time in an efficient way. It's quite hard to describe without pen and paper or a lot of mathematical terminology. But I don't know, am I allowed to use the word cosets?
Use whatever you like.
So essentially the way it works is that with SSC, you could conceptualize it as, well, with domino reduction anyway, you could conceptualize it as a set of cosets. So there's probably some way to bind each of those cosets down to a single point and then solve it very efficiently from each of those anchor points, so to speak. That sort of method is actually quite similar to what they use in the 20 moves suffice paper, except instead of having two intermediate states, they just solve it directly from domino reduction by using a coset solver, in that they solve every position in the coset down to just one position in that coset, and then they solve from that one position in the coset to the actually solved state. So potentially it's possible there's a way to do domino reduction for humans in that way, but it's very hard to know how someone would even find something like that without either a lot of programming experience or a lot of free time.
Yeah, that sounds difficult.
Yeah. So now we're on to a Briggs and Briggs 2 section. So I think most of us know that like the steps of Briggs, which is CP line, finishing off at first block, and then EO223 RB, and then two GLL. But what are the Briggs, like the Briggs 2 steps?
Yeah, so Briggs 2 is sort of like MCell. It's very much trying to play with the idea of conjugation, even though I hadn't quite hammered out exactly what conjugation was just yet. So you build first block with a pair off by an F move or something. Then you can, then keeping that pair together and just solving the rest of Roux essentially. So solving second block in a sort of conjugated state, you can use a very short set of algorithms to make sure that the corners end up in the correct spaces, so that CP will always be solved just by doing an F move. And then from there, you can just proceed with normal Roux. So it's very much like if you took 42, but instead of using all of the Cmll algorithms, you perhaps just use the adjacent swaps and the diagonal swaps, which turn out to be very short in this specific framework. So first square with a pair off by an F move, and then you build second square and so on.
And what inspired you to come up with Briggs? When did you learn about CP?
So, well, CP's always been a thing which it's been a thing that I've known about for quite a long time. I think the actual idea of how to do CP as the very first thing in the step, so without, say, solving the two down left corners and then solving CP, but rather just solving all of CP relative to one corner, came when I was looking over. Actually, it's a very great website. So, and I'm totally going to pronounce his name, but JAP. So JAAP. Maybe it's JAP or JAP or something. But his page is fantastic for anything, for almost anything to do with cube theory, and he has a list of diagrams which basically just draw out all of the CP states, and I just reverse engineered that to realize, oh, you can just solve CP at basically any time with one 3 cycle, and yeah, that's just where it came from. So I sort of alluded to it before, but almost all of my methods are just based around one specific thing that I put into a method, throw the method out, hope that people will use that specific concept which the method is based around in other methods. But yeah, so, well, maybe not so much with SSC, but certainly from Briggs onwards, the methods have always been the first good thing I can think of, but I almost never think it's necessarily the best way to do it. So in the case of Briggs, I came up with it because I worked out how to do CP, and hopefully other people will be able to use CP in their own methods.
What caused you to create another CP based method, which was Briggs 2? Because you had already made Briggs, and then what caused you to make another one?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, most of the methods are just the first things that I think of. Well, the first good thing that I think of and think of is worth publishing. You can't see it, but I'm trying to do air quotes. But yeah, so Briggs 2, but the problem with CP in the original Briggs method is that it just felt too forcing and too constraining. So I wanted to develop a way where you could do CP almost without trying, if that makes sense. So instead of having to, during inspection, work out this 3 cycle and then plan the rest of the solve around it, you could end up in what is now called a conjugated state, do the rest of your solving, and then just allow you to very quickly, very easily, almost for free, just get out of that state into a CP solve state. And that's where Briggs 2 came from.
Cool. So moving on to the section for other developments, Mcell ends up reaching a Nautilus shell state. So would that not then make Mcell a variant of Nautilus, or vice versa?
I suspect I'll get into this more, but I feel that a lot of the definitions for various things like methods, steps, variants, to some extent people place too much weight into each of these definitions. So the definitions, in essence, should serve the ideas, but the ideas should not necessarily serve the sorry, did I say that right? Yeah, the definitions should serve ideas, but ideas should not necessarily serve the definitions. So what I mean by that is when you define an idea, those definitions only really need to make sense in the context of that idea. So in this case, yes, you could call Mcell a Nautilus variant or Nautilus an Mcell variant. But would that really tell you anything about the methods? I guess to some extent it would capture the fact that they have the same state at some point, and potentially from there the solving would be fairly similar because there's a single best way to solve from there. But I'm slightly unconvinced that just labeling say method X is a variant of method Y. In some cases, that can be useful in that it explains to the reader that two methods are similar, but to some extent, saying a name is a variant of another name it doesn't really tell you any additional information, I think, in this case. So call it a variant, don't call it a variant, but maybe we just need to come up with some new terms which more accurately reflect what we mean.
So recently, it depends. It might be recently, it might not. From what I've heard, you talk about on Discord a lot, is you're trying to figure out how to classify methods into different categories. So what like caused you to just like really want to figure out a good way to classify methods?
Yeah, so I think what I'm doing nowadays is sort of a misnomer to call it a classification system. At least if you think of classification in the standard taxonomy sense. But I think fundamentally that there's two reasons. So firstly, I've just always been interested in trying to understand how and why methods work and why others don't. If there's a reasonable way to quantify if two methods are similar or two methods aren't, beyond just completely intuitive feel. So it's always just been a quite interesting question to me. When someone says method X and method Y feel similar or are the same method, what are they really saying in that sense? So, for example, you could I personally feel like MU last 5 edges and MU LSE are actually very different, even though they use the same move set, they solve almost the same pieces. But I guess I want to find a way to work out if there's a concrete way to express exactly what the differences and similarities are, as opposed to just completely going by intuitive feel. And the other reason is that the other more recent reason is that maybe I'll be swallowing my words, given that there are now a lot more people creating methods and being interested in methods than when I was particularly active with developing methods specifically. But I've always felt like we're almost running out of methods, at least in the typical way that people create methods, where they just put together random blocks and random steps until something works. So I wanted to see if I could try and find a way to break out of that system. So have a new way to come up with methods which possibly people just wouldn't have been able to think of before, specifically.
Okay. And so where do you think this will go in the future? Like, yeah.
So, well, maybe I feel like maybe I'm just too much of a method hipster in that I feel like back in 2014, 15, 16, it didn't feel like anyone was doing method development, but nowadays it feels like there are a lot more people doing method development. Similarly, at the moment, it doesn't feel like there are many people doing method classification or maybe method development or methods for creating methods, but maybe in a few years there might be more of that. But really, I just want to set up a collection of definitions, terms, ideas, which someone who wants to do methods can just read through and get a grasp very quickly on almost a philosophy of methods. Why do methods, for example, not have 6 steps in using the typical definition of steps, typical nebulous definition of steps that most people will use? Why do most methods only have 1 or 2 algorithmic steps? Why do most methods only have 2, maybe 3 intuitive steps, depending on how you count it? So really, I just want, my hope, and to some extent my prediction, is that eventually people will start, more people will start doing what I'm doing, or at least writing it down, what they think and why. Because I don't think with this classification or meta-method development, necessarily what I'm doing is complicated so much as it's just being systematized. So I actually mentioned this all the way back in the when you asked about my unique approach to block building, is in that I don't think what I do in terms of block building is actually unique. I just think it's been systematized. So similarly for methods and method classification, development, whatever you want to call it, I don't necessarily think what I'm doing is unique. I think I'm just codifying and systematizing my intuition for methods. And hopefully that is something that more people do as methods become more complex and as more people feel like we're starting to run out of methods or looking for new ways to create methods.
Do you think that the MCell concept could be applied in other alg sets? So like the steps after you solve the first block in 2x2x2 in the back. So do you think it'd be possible to apply something similar to other methods?
Yeah, really. So the reason I like MCell is that the way that MCell works specifically is that you can do the corners while not affecting the edges, and then it's very, very easy to solve edges without having to affect the corners just by using slice moves, setup moves, and so on. Whereas it's harder to solve edges and then solve the corners around those edges. But I don't see any reason why you couldn't have some sort of separation of pieces and then be able to recognize separate the pieces into 2 sections, then solve each of those sections without affecting the other section. So you can still do a 2-alg 1-look solution without having to do any quote-unquote look ahead when it comes to solving. So yeah, I think it could be applied to other alg sets. I'm not really willing to say which one specifically because how do you say it? Because I just don't really know which alg sets it's actually, which sets of pieces it's reasonable to separate and then they still have efficient independent solutions. But I can almost certainly say that some such alg sets where it's feasible to do that will exist, but they probably won't be as easy to find as solve corners and then solve edges.
Is it my turn?
Yeah,
Okay.
I kind of took yours.
Turns.
Yeah. So before we ask the next question, could you explain what the difference is between top-down methods versus bottom-up methods? I know you made a forum post about this.
Yeah, so I guess this was my earliest attempt at trying to explain my intuition for why certain methods are the way they are. But fundamentally, it's trying to answer the question, what do people mean when they say a method is roux-like or CFOP-like? And the conclusion I came to is that there's usually either a single step or a couple of steps which dictate how people think of a method or how a method is developed from there. So for roux specifically, I think it's LSE. It feels very much to me like the key step of roux is LSE, and everything in roux is just getting to the LSE state as quickly as possible. And so that's why Roo is a top-down method, because the key step is one of the final steps in the method, and everything else is just building towards there. And that's why whenever you have something which finishes with MU, LSE, L7E, L8E, even MU, L5E, if done intuitively in a specific way, people would say this feels like Roo. And similarly, if your key step is earlier in the method, then it would be a bottom-up method, in the sense that if the method has the key step at the start, then then people would generally think of that method as almost sprouting from those first few steps. So if we take CFOP and, for example, ZZ with EO cross, most people would say that they feel essentially the same in terms of solving. Maybe I shouldn't say most. I would say that ZZ with EO cross is almost CFOP in a hat, in the sense that since those first two steps are very similar and they're solved in very similar ways, then they feel almost like the same methods. But if you contrast that with something slightly more different, like say just ZZ, the classic ZZ, so ZZ EO line, left block, right block, and then last layer, I wouldn't say that just vanilla ZZ feels very much like vanilla CFOP, even though they can both finish with the same last layer. So yeah, that's sort of how it goes, in the sense that ZZ and CFOP and ZZEO cross feel quite similar because their first few steps are similar, and that's sort of the main characteristic of those methods. Whereas vanilla ZZ and CFOP, even though they both finish with last layer, they just don't necessarily feel quite the same, because ZZ, you are sort of restricted block building. And so I think that's where the distinction between those two methods lies. So just to summarize in a short way, most methods, in my opinion, have something called a key step. And the key step is really what people are referring to when they say one method feels like another. And for top-down methods, that key step is at the end. For bottom-up methods, that key step is at the beginning.
How does development of top-down in speed solving of top-down versus bottom-up methods compare?
I would say with development, well, I have a bias, and I'll be completely upfront about it, to top-down methods, because they just feel more elegant and easier to optimize and easier to look into all of the minutiae when compared to bottom-up methods, because bottom-up methods, their development at least feels very messy, in that you have the initial core steps, but then you just have so many possible ways you could look through and brute force some nice combination. So if you take CFOP, you have several dozen different last slot, last layer possibilities. And it's very hard to know which ones of those are really the best. So the development can probably sustain itself much longer, but it's much harder to get anything consistent between all of the everyone who uses it. And maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, but I just find that it always feels like you're wanting more, because there's just no way to know if what you've got is even the best or even reasonable. Whereas with top-down methods, it always feels like if you're aiming for something which isn't necessarily the solved state, then it just feels easier to have a look at the initial steps and optimize them. And then you also have the freedom to you do have the freedom to play around with them a bit more. So for example, in Roo, you can do non-linear first two blocks, for example, but it's still quite clear to see that first block, second block, CMLL, LSE, or at least, sorry, first block, second block, CMLL is the best way to get to LSE, just because it reduces ergonomics the best. It's the easiest to look ahead. It's most second block solutions can be influenced by a first block, whereas if you did two squares, it would be much harder to influence and so on. When it comes to speed solving, potentially, it's possible that bottom-up methods as a whole could be faster than top-down methods, because on average, because you have so many options to try and find a best solution after you do the key steps. So in theory, you can have much fewer key steps with a lot more options to explore, and so you don't just need to keep coming up with more and more key steps to work out how to solve the most effectively. You can just concentrate on the latter portion and make sure that you have the best each of them, and so on. Whereas for top down, it feels like every single time you want to try and find something better, you need to find a new concept, which is just, in my opinion, at least on the face of it, much harder to come up. It's much harder to come up with a key step than it is to optimize the final steps and just keep optimizing the final steps without having to come up with a new key step.
Cool. And the final question is, could there be a method that is both top-down and bottom-up simultaneously, which would obviously be difficult to develop? And do you feel that classifying methods as top-down versus bottom-up gives the developer sort of an excuse for the rest of the steps to be subpar?
Oh, well, this comes back to one of my earlier points in that this top-down and bottom-up and key step and sub-puzzle and everything I've used is in some way it's useful to introduce new people to these various concepts, or perhaps systematize for previously intuitive ideas so people can interrogate it more closely. I know you're probably drawing from when I said that potentially you could create a method which is both top-down and bottom-up. But I was trying to use that to explain that perhaps a method which is, if we find a method which is, as you say, evenly balanced, so to speak, then that method would be the best method to use. But if you can find such a method which breaks the admittedly quite surface level classification of top down versus bottom up, then by all means that could be the best method. But I don't think saying, oh, this method is top down, or oh, this method is bottom up, is really gives you a pass on whether on letting the other steps of the method be subpar. Particularly in top-down methods, I feel like it's very easy to call out someone as, oh, these first few steps suck, so what's the point of having a good final step if the first few steps suck? And by the same token, yes, you can solve, what's an example? Oh, well, using SSC as an example, in fact. Yes, these first few steps are very efficient. They get you there probably the quickest out of any existing method, but what's the point if the final few steps are subpar? So I don't think it really serves as an excuse, and I don't think that most method developers would take it as an excuse, in that they would want their method to be good so to speak, or at least, well, any reasonable method developer would want their method to be actually good, rather than being constrained specifically to what it is. And well, if we interrogate perhaps the premise a bit more of the question, so definitions, as I said before, are only as useful as the ideas they can express. So you can define a method to be top-down or bottom-up, but if that constrains your ideas, then you should feel free to throw that classification out of the window. So, for example, I could explain to you in a very specific, very technical mathematical sense what 42 does and how it's derived from Roux in terms of cosets, sets, group actions, very basic group theory, some graph theory, and all of that. But my question to you is that useful? Would it be more useful to have a very specific way of defining what 42 is from Roux in terms of all of the mathematical notation? Or is it more useful to just have a look at it and think, last 7 edges is actually quite similar to last 6 edges? And I can tell you now that's not something that will necessarily come across in any of the mathematical explanations for it. So yeah, this is my question for you. If you can define something very precisely, is that necessarily a good thing?
In my experience, it's just fun to define things as detailed as possible, but might not be useful.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely fun, but when you have people who instead of looking at the ideas that someone's trying to express, they immediately pounce on the definitions and just tear the definitions apart, I don't think that's a very constructive thing to do. So if you have a look at my posts on methods development, so in particular, the sub-puzzles, the post on sub-puzzles and meta-methods, you'll notice that I don't actually specifically define what a sub-puzzle is very precisely. I define it as precisely as I need to in order to explain my conceptualization of meta-methods and potentially how you could develop a meta-method based off some such concept. But so you could tear apart my definition of subpuzzle. It's very easy to do so. It's not particularly precise, but I don't think even if you did specifically tear that apart for not being precise enough, being somewhat arbitrary, not having concrete definitions, I don't necessarily think it invalidates the rest of the post, in that the rest of the ideas are, apart from the analysis I do at the very end, I think that the idea itself is something that can stand on its own, and the sub-puzzle idea is just what I use to explain that idea. So in some sense, it doesn't matter how vague the sub-puzzle, no, I misspoke. It does matter how vague the sub-puzzle is, but the sub-puzzle doesn't need to be any more precise than the idea it is trying to explain.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, that also leads into, well, maybe not leads into, but it's also part of why I think what I do with method classification, method development, whatever you want to call it, is not specifically new or groundbreaking or something that no one else could do. Because I think a lot of people have these ideas when it comes to method development and the constraints of methods and all of that sort of stuff. It's just that they haven't systematized it or worked out a specific way to try and explain it or any of that. So, we could come up with some sort of constraint classification thing right now. So, for example, here's a very basic observation. Corners are very hard to solve, so to speak, when you look at methods, but edges are quite easy to solve, relatively speaking. So whenever you have a method, the least forcing way, so to speak, would be to solve all of the corners, then solve all of the edges, because you can solve the edges without affecting the corners. And so just based on that very simple idea that corners are hard and edges are easy, you can still express something reasonably meaningful when it comes to methods. In particular, I just want to point out that those definitions, what I started with, corners are hard, edges are easy. Can you get much vaguer than that? I don't think you can get much vaguer than that, but you can still use it to express something meaningful. And I think that's what I want to start trying to get more people to do. It doesn't really matter how vague your definitions are. I just want people to try and define things and then try and see what the consequences of those things are. Or perhaps try and come up with an idea and then develop a few relatively basic definitions and sub-ideas to try and explain that idea to other people. And by the same token, I want people to stop trying to pounce on definitions and say, this definition is bad, it's far too imprecise, it's far too arbitrary everywhere. And I want them to try and instead think about the ideas which people are trying to express rather than just the definitions which they use to express them. There is a time and place for rigor and precise definitions and all of that in anything. I mean, I'm trained specifically as a mathematician, so I know that you do need to be precise, you do need to rigorously define and check your intuitions. But there is a time and place for that, and the place for that is not, say, on Discord when you're just having a chat about a new idea someone's just thought up. But yeah, I think I'll get off my soapbox now. But I think that's just something I've been wanting to say for quite a while.
Yeah. Well, that was the end. Thanks for coming on with us on the Methodical Cubing Podcast.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
joining us.
Yeah, no, I'd like to be able to chat more. Like, Discord's fun, but it's hard to just type everything out, especially when there are other people typing at the same time. It's much easier to just talk to people.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely.
Thanks for watching, everyone. This was episode 3 of our Methodical Cubing Podcast, where we talk about methods and method development and interview people. And we'll see you in the next one.